This program is made possible in part thanks to generous donations from viewers like you.
Hello and welcome to the Suzanne Atwell Show. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, the future of Midnight Pass in Sarasota County. What led to its closing 50 years ago? Renewed interest in restoration, and a conversation with local environmental, legal, and advocacy leaders about options and expectations. Our story begins when Siesta and Casey Keys were separated by a free-flowing pass. The first accurate maps, published in the late 1880s, showed a tidal inlet that connected Little Sarasota Bay with the Gulf of Mexico. Back then, it was named Blind Pass. The opening was a natural formation, likely caused by severe storms that breached the barrier island. In 1921, a hurricane split Blind Pass, which created Musketeer Pass, the original name of Midnight Pass. Both Blind Pass and Midnight Pass coexisted until 1924, when stormwash and sediment naturally closed Blind Pass. Midnight Pass remained, grew, and migrated south. In the 1950s, it reached a maximum width of 500 feet and a depth 13 feet.
The water quality was just like the Keys. We had 9 months of crystal clear water. And if you threw a quarter down there, you could almost read the date, but you could definitely see that it was a quarter. Mm-hmm. We had tropical fish that we don't have now. Mm-hmm. We had clam beds, oyster beds. The oysters was just as good as Apalachicola.
That was the story of the natural evolution of Midnight Pass. It remained generally stable in size and location until 1969. The next phase of the ill-fated inlet story was created by man, not nature. Large volumes of spoil produced by dredging were dumped on the north end of Casey Key and a small key located just inside the pass. The dredging of the waterway and the dumping of spoil reduced tidal circulation.
So they took all the limestone that they were digging up to make the intercoastal waterway, they dumped it on these mangrove islands, killing the wet mangroves. Mm-hmm. They didn't try to stop the flow of silt that they were pumping in, ground up limestone. Mm-hmm. And the overflow on the grass beds killed the grass, mm-hmm. killed the clams and the oysters. They did a lot of damage.
Simultaneously, the pass was migrating north and damaging the homes of wealthy owners like Sid Solomon. Solomon was a world-renowned artist who had significant political and social influence in Sarasota County. Renowned artists from around the globe frequented Solomon's beachfront compound. By 1983, encroaching sand was a direct threat to Solomon's property and that of his neighbor, Pasco Carter. Sid got permission from the Sarasota County Commission to fill the pass with the promise to dredge out a new channel at the north end of Casey Key. That never happened.
Sid, he just, after Carter died over this whole thing, I think he had a heart attack. And Sid, after 4 times, he got permission to dig it, and it was a joke. They didn't have a dredge. They brought in a drag line. And it was supposed to be 50 feet wide, 10 feet deep. And they thought, well, as soon as they dug this out, Mother Nature would start the flow of water. Well, I stood in there on the first dig, and it was high tide, and the water was just sitting there. And then as the tide went out, when it was supposed to be a big flow, the water just went down. It did not flow at all. So he dug it out, had a big pile of sand out there, and they dug it at the wrong time of the year. They dug it in, I believe it was November when our front started, our nor'westers. So they dug it out, nothing's moving. They got a big pile of sand. The next day or two, a front comes through. And I went down there to check it out. After the front, it's all filled in. And Mother Nature filled it in without taking any of the sand that they had piled up. Sid went to the county and he said, I can't afford it anymore. So, they let him off the hook.
And so it remains to this day, no midnight pass. That could change, but it is a very complicated and polarizing proposition. We begin our conversation with the Midnight Pass Society, the group that is leading the charge to reopen, or as they say, restore the pass. You are on the board of the Midnight Pass Society 2, local 501c3. What is its mission and what are the goals?
Our mission as a non-for-profit is really to spread awareness amongst the community, not only about the history of Midnight Pass, but what type of action we believe needs to be taken to reverse the cycle that's occurred over the last 50 years. We're a rebirth organization, so
Right.
our predecessor, the Midnight Pass Society, they fought a long, hard battle for 40 years and invested a lot of time and money, ultimately to not be successful. And so we're helping to revitalize that fight, and this is all behind protecting our area and protecting our community. We believe that even after we start to work on the pass, there's going to be future initiatives that we will need to fund and work on in
sure.
maintaining that pass.
What led up to the closing of the pass? And could you explain why the Intracoastal Waterway and the Oaks residential development are part of this whole story?
It's interesting that you bring that up. We've dug through a lot of documentation and research, and in learning about the history, it really starts back to when the Intercoastal Waterway was being dredged by the Army Corps of Engineers. A lot of those sand spoils were placed in different areas around the bay with really no plan of how they would migrate in the future. Midnight Pass was stabilized by two bayside passes, a north and a south pass that converged and stabilized to go out to the Gulf. When those sands started migrating and affecting the northern channel's flow, the southern channel remained unchecked and started to migrate. So a combination of factors occurring. Now, the homeowners who went to the Board of County Commissioners at that time received a temporary type of solution, right? We can close the pass temporarily under the agreement that it would be reopened. We never got to that reopening part. And the Oaks was involved. So in reading through a 1979 judgment that was between William Murad and also the Palmer family, the Oaks they were trying to actually create that subdivision and gain the zoning to develop it. Part of that judgment outlined that they wanted to barter the south end of Siesta Key, north end of Casey Key, and those bird islands there, as well as historic Spanish Point, in order to help redevelop that. So, about 130 acres went to the county fee simple when that judgment expired. And the language in it expired after 10 years. So the county has the property, which is really a plus for our organization and our mission, because we're not having to try to take over somebody else's property to accomplish this. It's the county's project, it's the county's property, and we're doing our best to support the county. So we're waiting to hear news on our recent appropriations request, which is $1 million that will go to the county in order to support their additional research and studies around permits. And so our organization has hired a coastal engineer who has experience with these type of projects to help make sure that we're taking the right steps.
So back in 83, the closure of the pass then, from your perspective, was that even legal?
It was legal in a sense that the homeowners were allowed to do it. It wasn't the original intent of the approval for the special permit to close the pass. We don't feel like there was a lot of effort or studies or research put into the reopening effort after it was closed to protect those homes, which is why it quickly closed every night, every time they attempted. Whether there was influence or politics that played a role in them being relinquished of their obligations, uncertain to say.
Let's go deeper. Let's dig deeper into this. Tell us about Sid Solomon and Pasco Carter.
Sid and Pasco were very influential in the community. They had quite a bit of star power behind their name, obviously Sid being a renowned artist.
Yeah.
And so I wasn't there at that time, but obviously their plight to the Board of County Commissioners must have resonated for them to be able to do what they did. That was a different time environmentally. We weren't thinking as much about what happens in the long-term future when we do projects like that. Right now, we put a lot more emphasis and efforts on what the long-term impact is to performing something like that.
Definitely.
And that was a different time. So, Sid and Pasco, they were able to accomplish, saving their homes, but at the cost of what? We believe the rest of the community's ability to enjoy those waters.
Final question, a compromise to creating an open navigable pass is to restore the circulation and the tidal flow via culverts. What do you say about that? Is that an acceptable option for you?
Well, I think we're really too early in the stages to be talking about solutions. We're just now coming to the consensus that something needs to be done about it. I think when it comes to the options of how we do it, how we accomplish it, we have to leave that up to the professionals. So our engineers, our scientists, and all the agencies that we have to coordinate with, and what's best for the environment for the future. We think that fixing a man-made issue with another man-made solution is just going to create future need for man intervention, right? For us to maintain culverts, for us to maintain jetties. We would really like to see it restored to its natural status, and we strongly believe that restoring that northern and southern channel will help that pass restabilize without the need of having other aids. When I first got involved with this organization, it was from a common sense approach of being on the water, seeing what the waters look like through New Pass, seeing what they look like through Big Pass, seeing what they look like down at Venice. That's what Midnight Pass used to look like, and that's what it should look like had man not intervened.
Restoring the pass to the natural state it once was is a tall order. It is critical that science and data, not politics or special interests, define the path forward. Our next guest is a world-renowned scientist, Executive Director of the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, Dr. David Tomasco. Welcome, David. It's great to have you back.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Let's start with a hypothetical. Midnight Pass is opened. First of all, where will it go? Second of all, what are the options in terms of restoration of the tidal flow between the Gulf and Little Sarasota Bay?
Yeah, that's really the most important question, which is how it would reopen. There is value to reestablishing a tidal connection between the Gulf of Mexico and Little Sarasota Bay. That's pretty straightforward. May not have been acknowledged in the past widely, but there is. The big question is, how do you do that? And so really there's kind of four options, and one of them is do nothing. Little Sarasota Bay is not dead. The water quality is not terrible. There are probably 10 million fish in Little Sarasota Bay, but they're small fish because it's a nursery habitat. If you like big fish, they have to be small first. And so doing nothing is an option. The other options basically fall into like three different categories. One of them is reestablish a wild pass. That was kind of the intent of what was the pathway about 15 years ago, and it didn't even come close to getting permitted because it was viewed as more damaging than the problem it was trying to solve. Dredging a 14-foot, 10-foot deep, whatever it was, channel from the Gulf of Mexico to the Intercoastal Waterway probably wasn't really necessary, and it just kind of disregarded how important the mangroves and the seagrass meadows are. So too damaging, it wasn't going to get permits. If the county decides to pursue that again, that'd probably end up with the same kind of result. The other options are, kind of a jetty, and a jetty would be something that, you wouldn't have to maintain as much, but it would also trap sand probably on the north side and starve the south side of sand, causing problems for people on Casey Key, honestly, and causing problems for sea turtles. That would be difficult. A fourth option is something that just allows water to pass, and that's the main thing you're trying to do. And so we brought up the idea of like, consider this as well. Consider the possibility of like a culvert. And I don't mean a couple of rusty pipes, with pumps in or something that a manatee can get stuck in. We mean something large. And so if your main focus is on getting water to move back and forth, there are plenty of examples of successful tidal restoration projects throughout New England, in Tampa Bay. I've worked on ones in Tampa Bay. I've worked on ones in Florida Keys. I've worked on a giant one in Puerto Rico. So if your first intention is just get water to move through there, then there are ways to do this.
So if it did open again, what are your reasonable expectations of water quality and seagrass improvements? Here we go again, seagrass improvements.
So there's plenty of seagrass in Little Sarasota Bay. There's 600 acres. And there's seagrass in the channel that takes you from the Intercoastal Waterway up to the Old Midnight Pass. The bottom of that area is seagrass. I was diving on that 2 weeks ago. So you would have winners and losers in terms of seagrass, but water quality would get better if you reestablish that tidal connection for two reasons. When it rains a lot in Little Sarasota Bay, the fresh water stacks up on top of the salty water underneath, and it causes what we call salinity stratification. That doesn't happen in Roberts Bay, doesn't happen in Blackburn Bay, happens in Little Sarasota Bay. And when the water stacks up, when you have that difference between the top and the bottom water is kind of isolated, doesn't get oxygen from the atmosphere, it's kind of dark, so it doesn't get a lot of photosynthesis, and that brings you what we call bottom water hypoxia. So salinity stratification, bottom water hypoxia, that causes, if you're a big fish, you just swim away. If you're a small fish, you're probably going to die.
And hypoxia, toxic.
Low oxygen.
Low oxygen.
Yeah, and so what we found is after Hurricane Ian, the only place in Sarasota Bay where we had salinity stratification and bottom water hypoxia was Little Sarasota Bay. We didn't have it in Roberts Bay, didn't have it in Blackburn Bay. We had it in Little Sarasota Bay, and it lasted more than 2 weeks, less than 4 weeks.
So what about the impact on mollusks and fish, and especially manatees? Do you see down the road an increased population?
Manatees aren't going to be worried too much about water quality. They live in areas, I've seen manatees in canals in the Miami River, but they need a food source somewhere around. So if you improved water quality in Little Sarasota Bay by allowing the water to move back and forth with the Gulf of Mexico, the water would get a little bit more saline, a little bit saltier. That should drive the nutrients down. That should drive the phytoplankton down as well. So in other words, saltier water has less nutrients, has less phytoplankton. The other thing that happened after Ian came through is the largest amount of phytoplankton, algae in the water, was in Little Sarasota Bay by far. And that's probably because it's a long residence time. The water now hangs around a lot longer than it did when that pass was open. But this is where it gets tricky. It depends on how you do that. So if you dig up 20 acres of seagrass to reestablish a tidal connection, first off, you're going to have to mitigate for that, and it's going to be 2 or 3 to 1. So in other words, you're going to have to find 40 or 60 acres if you dig up 20 acres that you're going to have to plant, and it's going to have to grow before you get your permit. And so that's a tricky thing, because where are you going to get 20, 40 acres of seagrass to grow? So I think it really comes down to reestablishing tidal connection is a good idea, but it's how you do it that matters. And something really destructive is going to be hard to permit, and it's going to be hard to show a net positive system response.
Right, and we've talked about all the opportunities associated with reopening. Okay, here goes. What are the risks? What are your concerns?
Well, anything you do to reestablish a tidal connection, whether it's a wild pass, jettied, or a tidal, will do kind of, it'll have not just positive impacts. So, for example, red tide. In 2018, red tide was really strong in the upper part of Sarasota Bay, where it was very well flushed. And it was really strong right around St. Armand's Circle. So if you remember what it was like in St. Armand's, red tide was wicked high there. And that's because you're right around New Pass and Big Pass. Little Sarasota Bay had the lowest levels of red tide during the 2018 event of most of the major segments that we have. And so that's because it takes a while for red tide to get in, and it's because it's a lower salinity. So you reestablish that tidal connection, you're making it easier for red tide to get in, and it's going to be a little bit higher salinity, which makes it a little bit better for red tide.
That brings us to my last question on priorities. When you look at all of the things that you have just said, the critical factors impacting our estuaries and the marine ecosystem, where do you rank this?
I think if I lived on Little Sarasota Bay, I would want this to be reestablished, in part because it was closed by humans. If you want to reestablish that connection, the worst thing you can do is to make it sound like gross water that needs to be flushed into the Gulf of Mexico, because that's not going to make you friends. It's not accurate, and it's not going to make you friends. The reality is, Little Sarasota Bay is a healthy system, but it's different than what it used to be. And it has problems that exist when it rains a lot that are unique to Little Sarasota Bay because the circulation has been changed so much. If you want to address that and you focus on the water quality, you might end up with a different kind of project than what you had 15 years ago, but it's probably a project that might be more likely to be successfully permitted.
Conducting an environmental impact report will be a critical step in the evaluation process. The legal path to approval is daunting. Local, state, and federal agencies will all have to sign off. Our next guest is a respected local attorney who understands the process and is a dedicated advocate for the environment. Justin, welcome back. It's great to have you again.
Thanks.
From a legal perspective, what do we have to go through now that we didn't before? The list of agencies, all the partners that are involved in this, that certainly would have to approve before this even happens, and how long that would actually take.
Yeah, so when you're looking at a project like this, it's a major project. Even if there are different possible approaches to it, but even the most minimal one, which it looks like it might be a culvert, is still a major project that's going to require a lot of different agency permitting and review. If people are familiar with what happened with the Big Pass dredging project, there might be a lot of similarities there. There certainly are permitting similarities where, in this case, I assume that the county would be the project sponsor. In Big Pass, it was the city. They had to seek permits. In this case, the county will seek permits from the state and definitely the federal government to do this project, which the guiding law for overarching law would be the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which governs definitely the federal review of this, which will be a major action. It'll rise to the level where I hope that the project sponsor will, if they get that far, get a full environmental impact study.
Does Suncoast Waterkeepers have a stance on this?
The Suncoast Waterkeeper Board has discussed it, and I think at this point we're going to follow the science and make sure that there's an adequate process. The reality is, I think, if something goes forward, which to get there, I think will be, it's a minefield. It'll be very difficult. And then the community is going to fight over it.
So you think this, as we move along, as opposed to a few years ago when all that happened, it just went by the wayside, that this new effort has legs and that we will continue this one way or the other?
It seems to me that the county is interested in it, that there's a lot of support for it, that they're going to explore the options, and given the trajectory, it's likely that they'll seek a permit for something there. What that is, we don't know. But I think, early in the game, up front, they should really seek the best advice as to the likelihood, the costs of to the community, that not only the fiscal impact, but the benefits and the consequences. And I think it's important to point out that the bay there has a lot of ecological function.
You are a trusted, valuable friend of the show here, and over time you've looked at you have pending litigation when it comes to water quality in our community. Where on the continuum do you place, with all you've done and all the issues you've been involved with regarding water and the health of our environment, do you place this in rank?
So I'm not sure yet. I think I'm not sure what this is yet. If this is a proposal to construct some kind of culvert mechanism to create some tidal exchange that is limited in scope, and again, we have to review what the potential impacts of that might be and the benefits. I don't see it as something that is going to be incredibly controversial. However, I think you really need to look at the cost of that, the fiscal impact, and also for the sponsor, which is going to be the county. Once you create this, you own it. And what are going to be the costs projecting this forward, and the likelihood of success or failure? And what it worries me is if it starts out as something like that, does then it have the inertia to where like it's not working the way we want it to? Let's widen it, or what I don't want to see is a jetty built there. I think it would be really damaging and consequential in a way that is not intended. And so with these considerations, I think, my focus really is on the health of the bay. That means the health of the community to me, one and the same. And you kind of asked me to weigh its importance. I think that's something that a lot of people need to weigh. So are we going to focus a lot of time and energy on tidal enhancement project there, and at what cost, versus what I think generally is more important is efforts to reduce pollution at its source to improve water quality there. And I'll say that across the board. I mean, while I think that this is an interesting and potentially really worthy endeavor, let's compare it to other potential projects that could have a bigger impact.
Well, there you have it, folks. While the science needed to frame a solution is not conclusive at this point, there does seem to be a strong support for doing something. Will Little Sarasota Bay ever return to the pristine place it once was? Not likely. Can we make it better than it is? Absolutely. But getting this done will require compromises and fact-based clarity of thought. Sentimental recollections about the good old days and alarmist claims that the bay is dead are not productive. County commissioners should seriously consider appointing the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program to create a nonpartisan advisory panel of experts. The Estuary Program has the experience, the knowledge, and the public trust needed to navigate this important initiative. If you would like more information on Midnight Pass and Little Sarasota Bay, you can click these links. And to see this show and all of our previous episodes, go to my YouTube page or website. That wraps up another one. Hope you learned something and enjoyed the show. Until next time, thank you for watching. I'm Suzanne Atwell, and I'll see you around town.
If you would like to support local public service programming like this, please visit our website, SuzanneAtwell.org, to make a tax-deductible donation. Thank you for watching.